Hey girl, Marissa here. You are listening to the Codependent Dummy podcast. As a young woman, you have been raised, reinforced, and rewarded for putting the needs of others above your own. Now, in your 20s, you're finding yourself exhausted, exasperated, and enveloped in shit relationships, especially the one you have with yourself. Codependency is a way of being where we put the feelings, wants, and needs of others above our own in an unconscious attempt to meet our own feelings, wants, and needs. Sorry to break it to you, sis, but that is not sustainable. This podcast is to help you undo all that so you can stop playing small and start taking up space, you dummy. Let's get to it. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Codependent Dummy podcast. Today, I am sitting with Judith Rabinor. Judy is a clinical psychologist, an author, and a writing coach who teaches online. She's the author of the book, which I have here, The Girl in the Red Boots, Making Peace with My Mother. I love it. A unique book integrating memoir, self-help for mothers and daughters, and a basic introduction to the psychology and psychotherapy of eating disorders. Judy, thank you for coming on the podcast.
And thank you for inviting me, Marissa. I'm looking forward to our chat.
Yes. All right. So this is the typical question I ask every guest. I'm curious, in your words, Judy, how do you define codependency?
So there are hundreds of ways to have a relationship, right? And codependency generally looks like an imbalance of power where one person is in charge, one person makes the rules, and the other person is obedient. I hate the word obedient, but that is the word that comes to my mind. And it looks, from my perspective as a relational psychotherapist, where to me, the hallmark of a good relationship is mutuality, is a give and take. This is not that. This is the opposite of that. This is one person being in charge and the other person doing what they want. But what we need to remember is that both people are getting something out of this.
Right.
The person who looks like they're being pushed around is actually doing something that's very comfortable for him or her. And I'm being very generous saying him or her, because it's generally, in our culture, it's generally women who are being the followers and men who are being the leaders.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes me sad to say that, but that is the reality.
Yes. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yeah, on codependency.
I define it as an imbalance in power. And
Right.
often there is one person who is intensely anxious and concerned with keeping the other happy. And so that person is always thinking, I once saw a classic cartoon. My husband died. I wonder what he'd like me to wear to the funeral.
Wow.
Yeah. Isn't that a great line?
Right.
Yeah.
Wow. All right.
So
Go ahead.
the person is in that one down position really has lost contact with their or her own wants and needs, and has another person who they idealize, idolize, and they have difficulty identifying their own feelings, their own dreams, their own hopes, their own likes. And often there is good reason both in the relationship and from the past conditioning. Yeah.
Right. Yes. That's a beautiful definition. Thank you.
Some people think that, there's usually chronic anger. Like the person who's in the one down position would feel angry, but often they don't. They're so used to it. Or the anger is so buried that, we as therapists are, how are you feeling about the fact that, your husband picked everything for the dinner on the menu, on the order in delivery? He picked everything. I'm feeling fine. I'm happy that I didn't have to be bothered. I like whatever he orders. Here's an opposite gender example. I remember a relative of mine where they were much older at the time, and we'd be in a restaurant, and his name was Sidney, and I'd say, "What are you having for dinner?" He'd say, "Hilda will decide. Hilda will decide. She decides what I'm eating."
Wow.
Yeah. And let's not be confused. I mean, if I had to order something for my husband, I definitely know what he likes, and I could pick things that he likes, but I would never order for him unless he was like tied up on a very busy call and we were both starving and we had to get out of there.
Right.
Right. So there are some aspects of it that permeate many relationships, but we're talking about a pattern.
Right.
A pattern. Right.
Yeah. Okay. And my vision for this interview, Judy, is to read quotes from your book. So I have 5.
Great.
Have you expand on them and how they connect to aspects of codependency, especially between mothers and daughters. Okay.
Beautiful.
So
about this.
What was that?
I'm excited about this.
Yeah, me too. Okay. So on page 27, you write, Judy, my early programming, I put ... So my early programming is what I learned as a small child who yearned for my mother's love and approval. Driven to please her, I absorbed and internalized her essence. Unconsciously, a part of me was still devoted to the voice in my head whispering, "Mother knows best." So I'm curious, what does it look like to absorb and internalize our mother's essence, and how might that contribute to codependency?
Okay. Well, as a small child, our parents are in charge. They have the car keys, they have the rewards, they have the bank account. And so if you grow up in a traditional, and maybe you wouldn't, I'm curious if you agree. In a traditional family, parents set the rules.
Right.
And parents tell the children, this is bedtime, this is dinner time, this is what we're doing on the weekend. And as children grow up, they start having a bigger say in the decisions that affect their lives. But there are so many unconscious ways that children absorb the power imbalance and the roles. And unfortunately, we live in a culture, and I certainly grew up in a culture. I grew up in the 50s. That's a very long time ago. Most of the listening audience probably grew up in the 90s. Do we think?
Yes.
And in the 50s, men were in charge. In talking about my book over these couple of years, I realized that one of the most important lines in the book is my mother was born in 1918, and that was 1 year before women got the right to vote. Right. Women did not have the right to vote. I mean, that is a glaring issue, that what the woman wanted didn't really matter. And, I've said this before in different interviews. When I was married as a young married woman, my husband went to law school and I was working. I was a teacher, and my first credit card was in the name Mrs. Arnold Rabinor.
Right.
Women didn't have the right to have their own credit card until, I think, the 70s. That sounds crazy, right?
Yes.
You were Mrs. Arnold, you were Mrs. husband's name.
Right.
I know. So all these are all very small things. The idea that men were the breadwinners and women were the homemakers. So women really were powerless. Women did not have financial equality. And recently a patient said to me, her husband, they were getting divorced, and the husband said to her, he who has the gold rules. And that meant he could hire a better lawyer. He could stay in a lawsuit as long as he wanted. And she would use up all her money. And that was true. So the idea that women were financially naive was prevalent, and it's still prevalent today. I have a patient today. This couple has tons of money, but she'll say, I have to speak to, I'm going to change the names. I have to speak to Bob to find out if we have money to pay the contractor. What does that mean? She doesn't even look at the checking account. She asks her husband. Her husband makes the final decision. Well, it's pretty hard to do a renovation on a house when your husband is traveling and you don't feel you really have access to your financial world, your financial life. So the question, so I learned that men sat at the table and women put the food on the table and took the food off the table. And sometimes men helped. Men helped, like maybe did the dishes, maybe dumped the garbage, but the woman's role was to serve the man. Yeah. And I wanted to please my mother because she was the primary parent. And to challenge that, where would I have even gotten the idea until I was much older that this is something that I should challenge, right?
Yeah.
So am I answering the question? I have to remember the question. Repeat it, please.
Yeah, just I'm curious, what does it look like to absorb and internalize our mother's essence, right? So I think in this situation, you had this thought, mother knows best. And right, that was internalized, and then it impacts you.
And it impacts you. And it's not unhealthy to feel mother knows best, but what we hope is that mothers will encourage their daughters to have a mind of their own. And in fact, later on, my mother did. But the point is, we really internalize early messages. You know, I don't know if anyone out here has, you know, in the audience is familiar with Clarissa Pinkola Estes. She's a young, isn't she great?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I love her.
She's a Jungian an analyst, and she writes about culture and myth and traditions. And she tells a story. I want to write something about this because this is a story I've told in a zillion workshops, and I wanted to weave it into the book, and I didn't. She tells a story about Vasilisa the Wise. And Vasilisa the Wise was a mother who was dying very young, and she called her husband and her daughter to her. And they were with her at the deathbed, and she took a little doll out of her pocket and she handed it to her daughter. She said, keep this with you. This will protect you. This will guide you. This will lead you. And the daughter, and then the myth goes on that the daughter had to face a lot of danger in her life because her father remarried, and he remarried a woman who didn't like her and had her own daughters. And she was sent to do all the chores, and she kept this doll in her pocket. And the mother says to the daughter on her deathbed, feed this doll. And of course, that's like a metaphor, you know, like feed it with your hopes and your dreams. Don't let go of them. Don't let go of them.
Right.
So she took her mother's essence, and our mothers, the good mother does give the daughter the tools of her life. And the tools of many mothers' lives is to be subservient.
Right.
For example, I remember a patient once telling me, I told my mother that I wanted something, a new brake front for her. She was young married. The mother said, just treat your husband good in bed, and that's how you get everything. The idea that, right, sex was a commodity, that
Right.
a reward for giving a big performance. Just do whatever he wants. I know. It's very depressing when you really talk about this, right?
Right. And
Yeah.
so, right, do you sense, like, as daughters with our mothers modeling subservience, at least growing up, we can potentially be subservient to our mothers, and then that just carries on in that relationship and other relationships?
We can be subservient to our mothers, and that sets a template of being subservient. And mothers teach overtly and covertly, serve your man, make your man happy. Now,
Yeah.
I recently heard the opposite, which is for men, happy wife, happy life. Keep your wife happy. Then you'll have a good life. That's new. I didn't hear that growing up. I heard keep your husband happy.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Let's see about the next quote. Let's see, page 66. So this is when your mother revealed that she had been having an affair.
Right.
And you wrote, she had betrayed me, her daughter. She had pulled me in the middle of her drama by asking me to keep a secret from my husband and brother. I should have said all this to her, and I should have asked her why she had to tell me. I should have reminded her that I had just lost my father and was in mourning. I wish I had told her that her happiness about her affair, her comfort, brought me neither happiness or comfort. But I said none of those things. I don't really know why I didn't have a voice. And then it continues. So I'm curious, how do we as young women lose our voices with our mothers when it comes to asserting our needs or vocalizing our disappointments and frustrations?
I was afraid to cross her. I was afraid to say, I'm too unhappy to hear this. I wish you hadn't told me this. Don't talk about it in front of me anymore.
Right.
And worse than that, because I don't think this is one of the questions you're going to ask me, but other people have asked me. So my mother had, right after my father died, told me about a long-standing affair she had been having.
Right.
And then she said to me a couple of months later, while I still was absorbing this, Lenny and I would like to get married in your apartment. Now you tell me why I didn't say no, Mom. That is not going to work for me. I am going to be too unhappy. I am going to be thinking about Daddy, and I'm going to be thinking about all this. Please have your wedding in a restaurant or somewhere that's not my house.
Of all the places in the world.
She wanted me to publicly endorse this. And in fact, I went along with it. And so you talk about a power imbalance. I was pleasing my mother. I was not in touch with what I felt.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes me feel sad for myself, as I think back. And yet I think this is a common dynamic in mother-daughter relationships, that the daughter wants to please the mother.
Right.
And perhaps feels that the mother's love is contingent on pleasing. Just like then somebody gets into the same kind of relationship with a partner, whether that partner is male or female, and they're a pleaser. And, that is what we say often about the typical eating disorder person, that they have 4 P's, that they're pretty, that they're popular, that they're a pleaser, and they want to always be nice. That's not a P. Or that they're perfect. They want to be right. And so this is about avoiding conflict. So I was conflict avoidant with my mother, but that doesn't mean I didn't feel it.
Right.
Then 10 years, well, I'm going to wait till you do the next quote and then we'll see.
Okay.
Just remind me.
10 years later.
10 years later, yeah.
Okay. Mark that. So on page 104, you had just been rejected by your best friend in 7th grade. The pain of 7th grade wasn't only about being rejected by the mean girls. It was also about feeling isolated by and disconnected from my mother. And this is your mother. This isn't really a big deal, she said. No more crying, Judy. And if you think losing your best friend hurts, just wait until you lose a boyfriend. A detailed narrative followed as my mother described her heartbreak when her first boyfriend dumped her. And you start to ask yourself, was there something wrong with me that I was suffering so much and making a big deal about something unimportant? So my question is, do you sense experiences like this, right, where our feelings are completely negated, dismissed, questioned, doubted? They teach us daughters to prioritize the needs of our mothers, right? She needs you to stop crying. She needs you to listen to her heartbreak story, right? So we put their needs above our own. And yeah, what does that do to us?
It keeps us disconnected from ourselves. We don't even know what we feel. We have another person's values. So, I mean, now if I was coaching a mother and a daughter in this situation, I would coach the mother. I would say to her, ask your daughter how it feels. Listen to how it feels when the best friend has rejected her, when your poor daughter in 5th grade has no friends. We know now that bullying and being scapegoated are really traumatic. They're traumatic experiences. But number one, my mother was, I mean, the way I came to make peace with my mother was to understand that some of the ways she behaved were actually in sync with the culture at the time.
Right.
That her passivity, I grew up, girls were told to go to college to get their MRS, to find a great husband. That was what you were supposed to do, find a husband. And a good husband, a good provider. That meant so that you would not have to work, as if having to work is horrible. Whereas I now know that having to work first of all, working is a blessing. Finding work that you enjoy is wonderful. It's what helps us grow. What keeps us alive in the world, having interesting, engaging work.
Right.
But as if what would really be satisfying is to do nothing, to have somebody else be making the money and you be taking care of the needs of the household.
Right.
At home. Yeah. These were the cultural values of the 50s.
Right. And also, do you sense part of the cultural values in the 50s for your mother growing up were, it's not a big deal?
Yes. So the whole world is now so psychologically attuned. And for example, the word trauma is now, I mean, there's a new problem. It's practically like overused, right? Like anything is a trauma. It's a trauma that a kid doesn't get into the right nursery school. Well, I don't know about that. But it can be a trauma for the parent who had heart set on this. I mean, that's what I call a misuse of the word trauma. But it wasn't really, when I grew up, we thought trauma was restricted to like World War II veterans, to people who had lost a body part, to people who had seen, bombs go off and buildings destroyed and families destroyed. And it wasn't until 9/11 that we really that I understood that the traumatic loss was everywhere, and that all different kind of losses could really be experienced as traumatic. So anyway, the 50s was not a psychologically sophisticated time. And there are many people who are still not psychologically sophisticated. I, over and over again, hear of people who would not consider psychotherapy for them or anybody in their family. They think that psychotherapy is like Buddhism, like voodoo. But it was really much more so then. You were just supposed to pull yourself up by the bootstraps.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that's important, that the world was not, the people didn't really recognize that all of us have positive and negative experiences all the time. For example, I was just at a shower. A woman in my family is getting married, and this was a big, fancy event. And there were tons of adorable toasts made. And no one talked about anything other than the most positive. And you really, I know this has been my experience going to weddings. 50% of marriages fail. Why do they fail? Because marriage is hard. That's why. And it's important to say that out loud. You know, we have an expression in our field, name it to tame it, right? If you name something, that gives you a framework to brainstorm and think about it. So to think that marriage is all about just having a lot of new silverware and plates and, you know, place settings that are all no chip plates. Okay, but that's not why people get divorced.
Right.
Getting along with another person is really challenging. It's also beautiful. When it works, it's beautiful to have a mate who supports you, who you support, who you stand by each other, and you both can grow. But marriage is hard, but most weddings barely mention anything slightly negative, even though everybody knows, everybody sitting at a wedding or sitting at that shower thinks, well, here's 28-year-old so-and-so going from her life that has to do with one person, her, and she's going to get married and have a family, and one day she's going to feel, where am I? How did I lose myself? How do I hold on to myself?
Right.
And these are very important questions to be asked. But that wasn't what it was like. And it's still, and this shower I went to was last weekend in a suburb of New York.
Yeah.
Right.
So we weren't psychologically minded in the 50s, and we're still learning. I know,
Yeah.
when I read this part, I had a memory. I had to sing the national anthem a lot when I was little, and I roll my eyes because really, I did not like it. I really didn't. And I remember one time I was sick and I didn't want to go and I didn't want to sing. And I think I've shared about this on the podcast before, but my mom was driving me to this park where I was going to sing. And Judy, my body started to react because I was like, I don't want to go. I don't want to. And she's just like, Marissa, you have to. And I was like, no. And like, my body, I was like having a fit, an actual fit. But, what happened, Judy? What do you think happened?
Well, what I'm thinking about is you were being treated as like an ornament. So that so often women are so overvalued for like pleasing others and performing and being pretty.
Right.
And you didn't want to do it. And you were not, your feelings were being ignored. Like, why did you do it? If you think about it, why did I have to have my mother's wedding?
Right.
Why did you have to sing the national anthem? Why? I guess, why do you think you did it?
Well, yeah, she just in a way conveyed you need to pull it together. You need to pull it together and you have to, I had to sing. I had to do it. And being that young, right? Yeah, questioning like, oh, I must be in the wrong here. I'm just having a hissy fit.
Right.
I have to do this.
As opposed to, this is just not sitting right with me. Did you have a very beautiful voice?
My dad would argue that, but I enjoyed it somewhat. I was more of a chorus. I wanted to be in musicals. I liked being in, with the 50 people dancing in the background, which is needed. I don't have to be the heroine. And
Right.
so, yeah,
Or
but
the
just
star, the movie star.
right. But I just shoved that all down, right? All my anxiety, and I sing. Right? Because I sense what you're saying, like still the culture, this is probably in the 90s, was was quit crying. You need to
Quit crying.
go and
Quit,
do what you agreed or you said you'd do. Yeah.
quit crying. And there's a passage in my book, I don't have it right here, where I'm talking to a patient and she says, I don't want to cry. And I read her a beautiful passage that says, tears are a gift. When
Mhm.
Adam and Eve were forced out of the garden, when Adam and Eve were forced out of the Garden of Eden, God said, tears are a gift. It is good to be able to mourn. It is
Mhm.
good to be able to mourn. Everybody is going to make mistakes. That's why they got kicked out of Eden, right? So
Right.
everyone's going to make mistakes, and mourning will help you. It's human to make mistakes, and it's human to suffer, and suffering is part of life. Nobody gets through life without having some hurt feelings. So back to my mother, why she would have to say, wait till a boy drops you, as if losing your best friend is nothing. Or what was it in your family that they couldn't hear? This is just making me too uncomfortable. I'm just not comfortable doing this. I have a grandchild who's feeling very pressured to play football. His father played football. He doesn't want to play football. He makes up lots of
Mhm.
excuses not to go to practices. So I think the urge to please our parents is quite universal. It's just that when that becomes the only story, and you can't, and so fortunately, his parents, my daughter and her husband, said to him, you can drop out.
Mhm.
That's what you wanted.
Right.
You can drop out.
Yeah.
And what I needed was for my mother to say, I'm so sorry that it hurts. Losing a friend is a heartbreak. It's a heartbreak. And life is full of heartbreaks, all different things: girlfriends, boyfriends, jobs you don't get, pregnancies that don't happen when you want them to happen, financial situations that don't arise when you were counting on them, right?
Right.
Life is full of disappointments, and there has to be room for them. And why was there even if we go back to codependency, in the codependent relationship, there's the boss, and then there's the subservient person, and that person is not going to complain. They're not rocking the boat. They don't
Yeah.
want to rock the boat. They want to please the other more powerful individual.
Right. Yeah. All right. Next quote.
Go ahead. Sure.
Page 138. This is a patient of yours. Marcy had been working with me in therapy for 6 months. When I began to worry she might get stuck in a cycle of mother blaming. I loved that sentence. And I'm curious to hear, how do we avoid, right? Speaking about our mothers and these times when they said what the culture, right, had what was, oh gosh, well, yeah, what was of the times. How do we avoid mother blaming while working through our codependency?
Well, I mean, I think the examples we're giving about singing the national anthem and about um, that when we understand that our mothers did the best they could, they thought they were helping us and training us and coaching us into living productive lives. And they didn't really understand that saying no is just as important as saying yes, and that crying is just as important as smiling. And they didn't understand it because they learned that when they grew up. And that's why some people talk about the cultural mother wound, that this is passed down for centuries, that women have served men and not complained. I mean, I know I went to Vietnam, this was before the pandemic, and I remember being in this little village. All the women were cooking and all the men were sitting around a campfire smoking. They had all worked in the fields. How did this division of labor get organized? This was their culture. This was their culture. This was their culture. So if you think that the most important thing is to please your man because your man is your breadwinner, and you teach your daughter that, you're teaching her the tools that helped you survive. You're teaching her survival skills. And so we all, whether we realize it or not, are thinking, what has helped me survive? What has helped me survive? And I want to teach my daughter those things. So I want to teach my daughter, get an education. I remember at one point me saying to my daughter, this is when my specialty was eating disorders, or when it started out, I said, just don't get an eating disorder, because if you do, I'll be out of work, and then you'll be getting a paper route.
Wow.
You know? Right. But so I think the way we avoid mother blaming is by really trying to understand our mothers. And that's not something we can do when we're teenagers. We can do it when we're older. We can do it when we're older.
And
if we're not too angry.
Right.
But it's like a light bulb goes off when you really realize that my mother really did the best she could do. And she really loved me. And she thought, you know, every little feather in my cap would help me have a better life. And whether that feather in your cap was singing the national anthem, or, you know, being pretty. And so mothers would value the things they thought would help their daughters live a better life. And now in 2022, we really all know, like, an education really matters. And no, I don't think most people are thinking that their daughter should go to college to get her MRS. We hope not, right?
No, we're getting PhDs now.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. And I'm curious, you did mention if you're not too angry, you can work through mother blaming. What if someone is too angry? What happens if
it's important that they have a real chance to vent and a real chance, but anger often covers depression. And when people are very angry and full of blame, what they're ignoring, what they're not doing is grieving. Is grieving. Like, what would it have been like? Like, I feel, I'll talk about myself, that in having my mother's wedding in my apartment, I did not express anger and I was not expressing grief. And it was only years later that I understood that I had kind of like delayed mourning from my father, because I got so caught up in being angry at my mother. And can I do the 10 years later thing?
Yeah, let's do 10 years later.
10 years later thing I wanted to bring up before is that, so when I was 30 and my father died, and my mother told me she'd been having a long-term affair, I didn't know what to make of that. I did not know what to make of that. And at first I just like listened and thought about it. And I mean, it took me quite a long time to process it. I was more angry at her that she told me than that she had the affair.
Right.
I wasn't really angry that she had the affair. I was angry that she told me, and I got involved in her and her wedding and the guy instead of being involved in grieving my father. And I probably felt lonely because I felt like I didn't have a fellow mourner. Here she is planning a wedding, and here
Right.
I am grieving. Anyway, fast forward 10 years, and now my marriage is falling apart. And I tell my mother, Mom, this marriage isn't working. We want different things, and I want to get divorced. And she turns to me and she says, don't get divorced. There's not a thing wrong with your husband. Men are difficult. You'll trade in one difficult man for another difficult man. And your husband, he's a breadwinner. He's the father of the children. He loves those children. Don't get divorced. Have an affair. Well, when she said that to me, first of all, I know it sounds funny that a mother would tell a daughter that, but you see, what she was doing is she was telling me what worked in her life. What worked in her life was not to get divorced. This is how she thought about it. So, and I've heard many other people say that. I mean, my ears are perked for this conversation because it was part of my life and my own conflicts that I had to work through. And she felt that she was, it took me a long time to understand that she wasn't being a bad mother in telling me that. She was actually being authentic. She was actually being authentic because that is what had worked for her. Just like the mother who tells the daughter, if your husband wants sex, sex. Never, don't be too tired. And the mother who doesn't tell the daughter, maybe you need to figure out how to enjoy sex. Maybe that mother didn't know how to enjoy sex.
Right.
And she never even thought about telling the daughter that.
Right.
So the daughter who is subservient to the mother often will figure out a way will take that pattern. I mean, this is why they say that codependency really originates in childhood, that one person learned how to be the boss, and maybe they had to take over a dysfunctional family where the father was an alcoholic, the mother was divorced, that person ran the family, then they get their own family and they start running the family with the same model in their being. It's not even a conscious model, the same model in their being. They're the decision maker. Other people will do as I say. So we're all in some ways prisoner of our own pasts. We're all repeating what it was we had when we grew up.
Right.
Yeah. And what can we do about it? We can spend time thinking about, how did I grow up? It often, someone doesn't really even understand that their family was dysfunctional until they get out in the world and they see how other families exist.
Right.
Now, that brings me to one of my least favorite conversations. That's the Brady Bunch. Because people often, we have our families as models, then we have television families as models. And the Brady Bunch, it seems to me, were this remarried family that everybody got along very well. And that makes people who are in second marriages with integrated families often feel upset if they feel like they're not living up to what they're supposed to.
Right. The new Brady Bunch is Modern Family, where it's like a grandpa basically marries a young woman and adopts her son. And then, there's like the main couple, there's the gay brother. But yeah, overall, they get along very well. And it does. I think people long for what they watch, not realizing it's a television show.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But I think, it's too bad we don't learn more in school. Kids are not learning about like the ABCs of relationships. They learn reading, writing and arithmetic, and what we need to learn is about relationships and resilience. The kids need really coaching in how do you overcome life's challenges. And I'm sure, the recent newspapers are really talking about, we're just having an epidemic of kids having mental health crises from all the anxiety that's been floating around the world in the last 2 years, and the lack of stability, the instability, the chaos. And of course, so many parents are feeling it. And then it trickles down into the families.
Yeah. All right. Any other thoughts on mother blaming?
Yeah, that if you really take time to stand in your mother's shoes. So, and most people, somebody just said this to me the other day. My mother got married when she was 20. It's as if I've never really thought about her as anybody other than my mother. Who was she? What were her hopes and dreams? And how did she come to be the kind of mother she became? And if you stand in your mother's shoes and think about the decisions she had to make and how she really felt, you can really develop compassion for some of what she went through. And, there's a big emphasis these days on self-compassion, that we are not perfect beings, that we are all people who make mistakes and get the short end of the stick sometime. And to be able to have compassion for ourselves when we don't like how we behave and when we don't like what's happened really can help us feel more whole. Not that life is so imperfect, and relationships are so imperfect.
Yeah. So really putting ourselves in our mother's shoes.
Yes.
Practicing self-compassion and some compassion for her too. Okay. Last quote. So this is from page 160. Many women have been trained to serve others and have trouble knowing and expressing their own wants and needs. Articulating one's wants is a skill that takes practice and a willingness to risk challenging the givens and facing the unknown. Oh, it's threefold, right? So it takes practice. It's a skill. It takes practice, takes willingness to risk challenging the givens and facing the unknowns. Where do we start with developing this skill?
Well, I think you would probably agree that I wonder if there's anybody out there wondering, am I in a codependent relationship? Am I giving up my autonomy? Am I listening to what my partner, my mother, or my partner is kind of dictating? And do I actually have another idea, but I'm afraid to say it? And why am I afraid to say it? Why, for example, is my patient afraid to say, I want all the bank accounts to have both of our names on them, so I understand what our financial situation is? Why is she afraid to say that? Because he's going to say, he's not going to want to do that. I don't know what her husband would say, but if he doesn't want to do that, because he might not really want to share power, he might want to keep the power to himself. So what's going to happen if she pushes and he pushes back? They're going to have conflict. And she may have made a decision that she'd rather live and be unhappy than argue and risk being unhappier, or maybe even the relationship breakup. And so in order to change things, we all have to really take risks, and that's hard. That's really hard.
Right. Yeah. So start with questioning, well, right, being aware. Like, am I in a codependent relationship? Am I being subservient to another? And then asking ourselves, well, why am I afraid? Why am I afraid to say, I want to be on the bank account, or I don't want to have the wedding at the apartment, mom, or I
need a Saturday to myself. This is whether somebody has children or don't. Like we all develop habits in our relationship. And how do you develop a give and take with somebody so that your partner's habits or your parents' habits are respected and yours are respected? You know, one of the things that I think, like, all families are the same story of ascending children and descending parents. And as children get older, they have more and more responsibility and autonomy. And yet some children are afraid to do things that they think will cross their parents. Their parents go to church. If they don't like church anymore, they just won't bring it up and tell their parents because they don't want to displease them.
Right.
And they may know in a very deep way that there is not room for dissension in this relationship. And they may feel, I can't change this person. So why should I create a lot of tumult, you know, a lot of anxiety for myself if I'm not going to change them anyway? I mean, this is a reason that lots of people don't come out when they're gay to their families, because they feel their family will not accept them. And it's a tough role as a therapist, right? Because you don't want to create an additional problem. On the other hand, we can all feel that inner child wanted to please their parents. And many parents are stronger and can tolerate more than a 25-year-old thinks. But this does always involve risk, because a parent or a partner may be furious.
Right.
May be furious.
So
So the parent who kind of is holding all the chips, all the cards in their hand, may not want to give any up, but may actually be willing, maybe more willing. So we all operate with old scripts, you know, what happened originally.
Right.
The families we grew up in.
Yeah. So becoming aware, asking ourselves questions, and
taking a risk,
right.
asking yourself what you're so afraid to lose. Like, what if, you know, there may be a period of disquiet in a relationship. There may be a period where a relationship doesn't feel as comfortable in the state of imbalance as it once did. And how are you going to risk that? How are you going to will you be able to talk about it? You know, I'm the kind of person who thinks talking helps. That's why I said the line, name it to tame it.
Right.
But all of life is a series of transitions. And if the transitions can't really be talked about and negotiated, and people feel they can speak about what's hard for them, they are not likely to get empathy or compassion from their partner or their parent who doesn't know. So to go back to myself, I mean, it took me till I was an adult to say to my mother, why did you do that? And she said, I thought I was doing the right thing. I said, well, it wasn't. And I was sitting around moping. I'll tell one story, the way the book opens. Is that I tell the story that when I was 8 years old, I had to have my tonsils out. And instead of my mother telling me you were having your tonsils out, she told me I was going to a birthday party. I got all dressed up in the party dress.
She got dressed up.
And she got dressed up and I got dressed up. We got dressed up like we're going to a party. I know it's crazy, right? You're not going to believe this story because I should write an article about this. So, and then she takes me to the hospital and I don't really gather what's happening until it's time to say goodbye. And I'm on the gurney and I'm going off with the nurse and she's going home. And years later, I said, why did you do that? She said, that's what we were told. That's what the doctor told me. And I actually looked it up on the internet. And it is true that many doctors told people to deceive their children. Why? Because I didn't want you to worry about going to the hospital.
Right.
Okay. So this is right before I published my book. And I was in a lawyer's office and I was getting ready to leave. And I said to her, we have to make an appointment for next week. She said, I can't make an appointment. My daughter is having her tonsils out. Boing, a bell goes off. I say, really? How is she doing with that? This lawyer, this was in the year 2020, says to me, she doesn't know. The doctor told us not to tell her.
Wow.
I said, when are you thinking of telling her? The night before. I say, well, listen, I'm about to publish a book, and that was a trauma in my childhood. So maybe give her a few days, prepare her, get her a little cute suitcase, give her a teddy bear that she can take with her, think about a book that you can read her, and then she can take that book with her. I mean, times have changed, but she had not been told. So that same icky philosophy is still drifting around. So I told this woman about this, and then she actually wrote me an email a week later. Thank you so much for suggesting that we prepare her. But my mother thought she was doing the right thing. She didn't think she was doing the wrong thing. And just like it might sound very innocuous that your mother forced you to sing the national anthem, but the fact that it felt forced, we know now the trauma is not an act. It's what it feels like to the person. It's feeling like a victim. It's anybody listening. It's not like telling your child, sing the national anthem. You have a beautiful voice. I want to see you up on the stage is a bad thing. It was a bad thing for you in the context of your personality, in the context of your relationship, right?
Right.
So without having a lot of conversation, it's hard to know if somebody is being really helpful or they're being a dictator. In some marriages, it's fine that one person takes over the financial responsibility. It's really fine. Some people think that's fine. I have a friend, she's a therapist. Her husband does everything with the money, the marketing. He's not working. She sees patients. That's their relationship. It feels fine to them. It's when it doesn't feel fine. So how would you know if you're in a codependent relationship? By checking in with yourself, by asking yourself, how does this feel? Do I feel that we have give and take? Do I feel like he takes care of me or she takes care of me and I take care of him? I take care of her. Does it feel like we're doing something that's acceptable to both of us? And it doesn't have to look the same to all people. Right. Some people love cleaning. Some people don't. To the person who loves cleaning, that's the good job. The bad job is the laundry. So there's
There's no
There's no real formula. It involves conversation. But so often in a codependent relationship, one person is spending all their time worrying about the other person, worrying about pleasing them, feeling anxious about not pleasing them. And their concern about other people, another person, sort of eradicates any space, takes up all the space. So they can't even really think, what would I like to be doing on Saturday afternoon? I've often thought so many women are watching sports on television and they say, oh, they don't like it. And I say, well, how come you're doing it? I don't know. That's what we do. That's what we do.
Yeah. So really, like articulating one's wants. So becoming aware if our relationships aren't mutual, asking ourselves, what am I afraid to say? Well, just different questions. Yeah, like what do I want to do? What would I want to do this Saturday?
And what happens if your partner or your parent doesn't approve of a decision that you made to work on Saturdays, to be gay, to buy a house that they think you can't afford, to buy a dress that they think is inappropriate but you think is adorable? What what if your partner disapproves of something you're doing? It is not possible. No two people on earth agree about everything.
Right.
So what is it like to tolerate a little dissension, a little disagreement? Is there room in a relationship, or does it have to be that one person is setting the rules and one person is obediently following them, obediently obeying them?
Right. All right. Well, I see we're hitting our hour, Judy. So I know I had a couple more questions. I'm curious, your final thoughts? Anything you want to add?
Um, well, I'll tell you what I want, a couple things. It is never too late to improve a relationship. All relationships can use improvement. And there's no perfect relationship. Somebody wrote a book, I forget who, and it's called Perfect Love, Imperfect Relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And so relationships can always improve, and they can improve by a willingness to communicate. And probably the most important part of communication is listening. Most people are busy planning what they're going to say while the other person's talking, but really listening and really hearing what your partner or parent wants or thinks. It doesn't mean you have to give it to them. Maybe you can't. Maybe you don't want to. I mean, someone told me a story recently. She said, my friend told me my mother, she's like a vulture. She's like sucking on me. She just wants to be on top of me all the time. And to be able to say, Mom, I love you, but I need more space. To be able to hold both of those thoughts, I love you and I need more space. So strike that out, the but. But is not a good word in that conversation, in that sentence. I love you and I want more space.
Right.
I don't want to collaborate with you. A friend of mine told me she's going to teach her mother pickleball. She said, but I hope she knows she's going to have to get her own friends to play with, because I don't want this to be my responsibility. I said, well, how sweet of you to teach her, and how honest and authentic it is to say, great, Mom, now maybe you can go take some lessons and the teacher will find some people who are your age, because I like playing with people my age.
Right.
Because we're really not the same age. We really don't have the same skill set. Even after you learn, you're still going to be my mother and need to play with your friends, and I want to play with my friends.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds so simple, right? It sounds so simple, but it's often so scary, because when these patterns get embedded, that like I have to please another person, and they're often unconscious, like in my book, that my mother had like a mantra, everything's going to be fine. And so therefore, I think I became a therapist so that I could help people know that everything isn't always fine, and that's okay. It's okay when things aren't fine, because that's just life.
Right.
If you have a baby, you may love your baby to pieces and you may be exhausted. You may think, oh my God, I didn't even know I was signing up for this. Exhaustion.
Yeah.
Interrupted sleep. And I think my baby is just adorable and precious.
Right. So making room for the and.
Yeah, that's a good one, right? We can hold ambivalent feelings about everything and everyone.
Right.
And we can talk about it because we have them. Everybody we love has some qualities that are not so lovable.
Yeah.
Everyone except you and me.
Except Judy and
Right, right. Everybody has qualities that can be a little annoying. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with them or you.
Right. Okay, Judy. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
This was really fun. I enjoyed
Yes.
thinking about codependency and how to recover, how to work on relationships. Relationships are works in progress, lifelong works in progress, right?
Mhm. Yes. And the book for everyone, The Girl in the Red Boots, Making Peace with My Mother. I'll put links to your website where they can find it. And you do have a mini book containing imageries of healing the mother-daughter relationship that I'll also share with the listeners.
Good. They're little exercises that people can do on their own. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so yeah, links to Judy's website will be in the show notes. And thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Marissa. This was fun.
Yes. Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Hey, girl. It's Marissa again. I'm not like a regular podcaster. I'm a cool podcaster, right? Thank you for listening and staying till the end. You can find me on Instagram at Therapy with Marissa. Email me, marissa@codependummy.com. Check out codependummy.com for more information on the show. And baby girl, a subscribe, rating, and review would be much appreciated. Till next time, I want you to remember, if you are feeling unseen, I see you. If you are feeling unheard, I hear you. And if you think that you don't matter, know that you matter to me. I want you to go out there so you can stop playing small and start taking up space, you dummy. And now, the disclaimer. Girl, this is not therapy and I am not your therapist. This podcast is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information in regards to the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, publisher, or guests are rendering any legal, clinical, or other professional service. If you want or need a professional, please find one.